This is a discussion of updated IRP modeling and interim targets, and in some ways leads into the next section of the conversation. But let me draw your attention to the big blue box on the left. And here we're just describing the kinds of updates and assumptions that go into inputs whenever we go down the road of creating a new study. The primary things that we need to update, whether it is for a 2-year progress report, or whether it's for an IRP or some other purpose. The primary inputs that we need to get updated are the load forecasts and the price curves. Those are fundamental. The load forecast, of course, tells us how much energy we need to meet customer demand. The price curves tell us what that energy is going to cost if we have to go out and buy it on the market. Price curves also tell us what the relative value of the energy that we generate might be. Also on this list, we refer specifically to the 2020 all source requests for proposals. But in any given point in the future, it could be the 2022 RFP or some other request for proposals that we're pursuing. But just the important part of it is that we take that into account when we initiate a new cycle of inputs and assumptions. Other contracts, things that have been signed since the last time we did an analysis, contracts that have ended since we last did an analysis, anything like that. And finally, post-modeling state allocation assumptions. And this has become more significant to the integrated resource planning process itself as time has gone by because of state legislation. The system-wide portfolio that we have traditionally developed for an IRP, did not consider allocations to various states very much, because the perspective was that the advantage of participating in a system-wide multi-state solution was that the customers in various states could reap the benefits of what the other states were doing, because PacifiCorp operates as a system and it lowers costs for all of our customers. But with some state-specific requirements that need to be acknowledged, there are now post-modeling allocation assumptions that we have to make. In some cases, we have to make those assumptions even in advance of knowing what the answer is going to be at some point in the future. And for those of you who might be familiar, I'm referring, of course, to MSP, or the multi-state process. Moving over to the green box on the right, moving away from inputs and to outputs and outcomes, the modeling that we do in the IRP group leads to these updated capacity expansion plans or portfolios, and also leads to new dispatch outcomes. How is the system going to operate with these new resources? CEIP targets are energy-based. This is very important because it means that any change to hourly dispatch changes the annual forecast of renewables and non-emitting energy that's available to serve Washington retail sales. Meaning that even if we don't change the portfolio and keep the exact same set of resources, if prices in the market change or some other change takes place, new legislation, it can change how the system dispatches and therefore affect how we achieve targets. And that second bullet over here, the decrease in forecasted targets for 24 and 25 is exactly such a case. So in other words, from our initial CEIP to what we saw in the 2023 IRP, and what I expect we'll see in the upcoming update, there's a shift resulting from higher loads, less renewable energy contracts, and state resource allocations. And hopefully that ties together how the IRP and the CEIP portfolios eventually lead to the development of resources to create future portfolios, and some of the considerations that go into the inputs and outputs. And I think I will leave it at that. And from there, I'm going to turn it over to Rohini Ghosh to talk more about specific and interim targets.
Thank you, Randy. Can everyone hear me and hopefully see me? So I can't see myself.
Yes.
Awesome. So actually, before I jump into the interim and specific targets, I have one more piece that I want to touch on. As Randy just described, the IRP modeling and outputs are used to assess our compliance position against these CETA clean energy targets and whether or not we need to take additional resource actions in order to meet those targets. And so from that actually falls this calculation of the incremental cost, and it's another key piece of the CEIP that is also based on IRP modeling. And sorry, I guess before I jumped in, I should have introduced myself. I'm Rohini Ghosh. I'm a senior resource planning and valuation specialist, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about clean energy plans and also multi-state allocation. So the Washington IRP two-year progress report that we filed earlier this year did include an updated estimate for the incremental cost of CETA compliance for the remaining years in the CEIP planning window, so specifically 2023 to 2025. And as a quick recap for what the incremental cost is, although anyone who's read the CEIP is probably familiar, the incremental cost is simply an estimate of any costs that are incurred by the utility in order to take actions to comply with CETA and the various legislative requirements. And so there was an estimate of the incremental cost in our original 2021 CEIP that was updated in the refile. And we have now added a new update that came out of the two-year progress report based on the latest IRP modeling runs. But the kind of key here from what came out of the two-year progress report and what's going to go into the biennial update, there are essentially no substantial changes in what are called the modeled incremental costs for the CEIP planning window. And the key reason is because we don't actually have any incremental resource actions that need to be taken in the CEIP planning window to meet compliance. A big part of compliance in the coming years is us getting out of those coal resources in Washington. And as Matt talked about up front, that is, those are actions that are being taken. But from a compliance target position, there are no other actions that need to be taken. So there's no incremental resource additions. If you recall a figure from a couple of slides ago, we showed that small incremental resource addition in 2030. And that's really the first year that we're perceiving needing to make incremental resource additions on top of what is already optimally selected in the portfolio under the social cost of greenhouse gases. And so that is essentially not a change from our original 2021 CEIP. So while the estimate for the incremental cost did change slightly, as I'll show in the next slide, the key here is that any of those modeled changes coming directly from the IRP portfolios are really just model noise and not really a result of any substantial movements or changes in the portfolio itself. There are also what we call non-modeled incremental costs, and these are very real costs that the utility is incurring in order to meet the various objectives of CETA compliance, things like administrative costs, staffing requirements, the cost of doing a lot of our stakeholder engagement, and things like that. And so I will show that on the next slide. Thanks. So I'm going to go over this very, very quickly and not spend a lot of time here, but of course, welcome questions later on. This table on the right shows high level what goes into that incremental cost calculation. And another quick recap for how this is done. The incremental cost is essentially calculated by comparing two portfolios. The first portfolio is called the alternative lowest reasonable cost portfolio, and that's essentially what we would do in the absence of those clean energy targets that we have to meet, and that is the portfolio denoted P-SC in the two-year progress report, and that's our optimal system-wide developed portfolio under the social cost of greenhouse gases. And then that's compared to our CETA compliant, our CEIP portfolio, denoted W-10 CETA, which just is our portfolio that essentially layers on any incremental resource actions that we need to take to meet those targets. And like I said, those actions only really occur outside of the current CEIP planning window. So in this figure to the right, in this table, the top half shows the modeled costs, so things that are coming directly out of our portfolio comparison. And you'll see that in the second row there, you fixed costs, there's essentially a zero change. And that's what we would expect because, again, there's no differences in capital investment costs or resource decisions. So that's good. That's what we should see. And then there's a bunch of, small numbers that are mostly rounding to zero that show, some numbers for total variable cost differences. Again, this is really just model noise. Anytime we create a new portfolio and we run it through our model that comes up with optimal dispatch, there are millions of variables moving around and recalculating dispatch every single model run and for every year. And so it's very likely that there's a little bit of noise and a little bit of small negligible differences in dispatch that result in a slightly different variable cost. Again, we would really consider that to be zero from a modeling perspective. And so the key kind of non-zero incremental costs here are on the lower half of this table. And these are the non-modeled costs, things that are incurred for administrative and general types of things. You can see demand side management program costs, outreach costs, material staffing, data support, lots of general things. At this point, these costs have not yet been updated from what was in the original CEIP, but they are still being evaluated and could result in different estimates for the biennial update. But all in all, if you take this together, then we get an estimate of an average incremental cost of $2.13 million on average per year. This is not a lot in the grand scheme of things and is well below the cost cap for what a utility might spend to meet CETA compliance. Great. So moving to the next slide. Now we can jump into the interim and specific targets. I think there's been a lot of sort of discussion about this up front and alluding to what we're going to talk about. And so I just want to preface this with some review of language and terminology, because I think it can get really confusing to keep track. But per Washington rule, a clean energy implementation plan should include both interim targets and specific targets for a utility. So the key difference here is that the interim targets are typically shown for the entire 2025 year forecast period, and they demonstrate how the utility will make reasonable progress towards meeting the clean energy standards. And so these are really our targets of having coal out of rates by 2025, having GHG neutral energy by 2030, and completely zero emissions by 2045. And those interim targets are very specifically expressed as a percent of Washington forecasted retail sales of electricity supplied by non-emitting and renewable resources prior to 2030. So in 2030, we are required to serve at least 80% of Washington retail sales with only non-emitting and renewable resources. That additional 20% to make this GHG neutral can be supplied by things like purchases of unbundled RECs. And that's what we can rely on in those forecasts. But by 2045, it should be 100%, non-emitting energy. Then we also have things called specific targets. The specific targets are, like the name suggests, more specific detailed targets specifically proposed for the utility's energy efficiency, demand response, and renewable energy actions for the CEIP planning period. So here we're really focusing on 2023 to 2025. And for energy efficiency and demand response, these targets will include more specific budget and program information. And the renewable energy target is actually also to be expressed as 8% of retail sales. So we can go to the next slide. So we're going to jump right into interim targets. And to start with, I'm just going to quickly show this picture of our 2021 CEIP interim targets. These are from the March 2023 refile. And this is just essentially showing the company's progress towards our GHG neutral supply of Washington retail sales by 2030, and then moving through 2045 when we achieve 100% of that. And so just, maybe keep in mind what this kind of trajectory looked like. We can go to the next slide and show an update from the modeling in the 23 IRP and the Washington Progress Report, and that will feed into the biennial update. So I think what's immediately noticeable is that 2023 through 2029, in the first couple of years leading towards our GHG neutral targets, are definitely a little bit lower and slower progress. And this is largely due to all of the things Matt and Randy covered earlier that have led to some differences in what our resource mix can look like in the immediate future. And also some of this is due to adjustments to the post-modeling allocation assumptions that have to be made in lieu of an agreement for multi-state process. But given all of that, the company's trajectory is still very much moving towards this GHG neutral future and reducing emissions drastically for the system as we move out in time. And at about 2032, we're actually meeting 100% of Washington retail sales with this renewable and not emitting energy, even without additional actions. And so that small incremental resource that needed to be added in the 2030 timeframe, that just boosted us a little bit faster in that 2030, 2031 years. But 2032 onwards, the company's plan is to acquire a lot of this renewable and non-emitting energy. And so we're very much aligned with CETA objectives, as I think this picture shows. And so moving on, we can, so this is just a table of those interim targets for the CEIP window. Just to note that the 2022 values have not been updated because that's looking backward now. So those are just the original forecasted values from the CEIP. But we've updated it for 2023 to 2025. And again, as discussed, these target percentages are a little lower than what we originally envisioned, but again, it won't derail us from really trying to make as much progress as we can and as fast as we can. So I'm going to keep going because I know that I'm basically over time. But jumping into specific targets. So my last slide here is on the renewable energy target, and it actually looks identical to the slide I just showed you. We are required to show a renewable energy target separate from our sort of broad interim target that can include any type of non-emitting technology. But for the CEIP period, our interim targets are all made up of what are considered renewable energy. This does include hydro, for example, but this is essentially all hydro and other renewable energy resources that typically receive renewable energy credits. And so this is just to show you what that specific target looks like, but it is actually identical during this time period. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it along to talk about demand side management resources. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Schaefer. I'm the manager of customer program planning and development. I wanted to talk through a little bit of our specific targets for our demand side resources. The first that I'd like to talk about is our demand response resources. And so in the 2021 CEIP, we identified a target of 37.4 megawatts to be achieved by the end of the CEIP period, which was 2025. At that time, the company did not have any demand response programs yet available. I'm happy to report that the company has since launched 3 programs, and those include the irrigation load control program, a commercial industrial curtailment program, and a residential demand response program, which includes direct load control of water heaters and a smart thermostat program that can control heating and cooling equipment. We're still very early on with these programs. All of them have been launched within the past year. The most recent program that we launched, the residential program, was launched about 2 months ago. So, really, really fresh. We're still in the early phases with these programs and um, just starting to enroll customers and really kick off marketing and outreach campaigns. And so we're still learning a lot about what participation looks like, what customers are willing to engage and enroll, and not only enroll but maintain participation over time. And so we're constantly assessing, what the the, the programs will look like going forward. So we're really evaluating currently, how well we're progressing towards that target. If you look to the right, you can see our current progress in terms of enrolled capacity for the programs relative to the target. Um, we're working with our field staff to understand what they think and what they're hearing from customers about potential future participation. We're also, um, really focusing and pushing hard on making sure that we expand these programs, continue to enroll customers, and also maintain that enrollment throughout time. So we really want customers, to have that first experience be a positive one, and they continue to participate as we mature our demand response portfolio. Additionally, the final piece is that we've been exploring new demand response programs, such as an electric vehicle managed charging program, um, and also a customer battery dispatch program. And so we expect to have more activity for those in the future, and to expect to have those programs also help us achieve our demand response targets. So there's a lot happening in this space. It's really exciting. There's a lot of great work going on by field staff and our demand response program manager, and we think we've got the programs out, and we're just going to continue to assess, where they're at with respect to this target, and try to understand, what the future looks like for demand response and capacity. With that, we'll jump to the next slide on energy efficiency. So energy efficiency is fairly straightforward, and I say that because we have this process ongoing regardless of the clean energy implementation plan. So we've been engaged in target setting for energy efficiency for quite some time. Our energy efficiency targets are based on the Energy Independence Act, or the EIA targets that we use in our biennial conservation plan, which is conducted every 2 years. So when we did the 2021 CEIP, we had goals that were characterized for 2022 and 2023 in the biennial conservation plan that was being completed at that time. And so if you look at the top hand table, you'll see that the 22 and 23 targets came from the biennial conservation plan at that time. And what we said for 24 and 25 was that we would just assume the same level of acquisition that was previously stated in the biennial conservation plan at that time. Fast forward to today, and we're in the process of developing targets for our 2024 and 2025 biennial conservation plan. And so the proposed updates that we plan to make are updating 24 and 25 to reflect the current biennial conservation planning process. One other item that we plan to make is that the EIA targets that programs are, tasked with meeting by the rules are characterized at site. And what that means is that energy efficiency savings take place at a customer site. But to deliver power to them, there's some line losses in there. And so often you'll see savings characterized at generation. The numbers are equivalent, just one accounts for line losses and the other does not. Here, we've decided that we want to align with how the EIA target is, which is characterized at site. And so we'll just be updating those numbers to be characterized at site. We'll also, in subsequent slides in the DSM workshop today, talk more about that target setting process and all the various components to that process. So that's what we have for demand side resources in the CEIP specific targets. Unless there's any questions, I'll pass it over to Laura James to discuss customer benefit indicators.
Thank you, Peter. And yep, just a reminder that you can feel free to drop in questions into the chat at any time, and we'll be sure to answer those throughout the rest of the presentation. But Laura, you're up.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Laura James. I'm in the planning group at PacifiCorp. And as Peter mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the customer benefit indicators that are in our CEIP. So one goal of CETA was to ensure that all customers are benefiting from this clean energy transformation equitably. So as part of our process to develop our CEIP, we worked with stakeholders and our advisory groups to identify 9 community benefit indicators, which we abbreviate as CBI, and at least one, sometimes more, associated metrics for each of those CBIs. So we will use these CBIs over the lifetime of our plan to evaluate the equitable distribution of the benefits that are resulting from our programs, actions, and investments. The chart you see on the screen now shows our 9 CBIs on the left and the associated metrics on the right. I realize this is a lot to read on a slide, and it's pretty tiny type. So you can find these in our 2021 CEIP that is on our website if you want to take a closer look. So in 2021, when in our original filing, in addition to identifying these CBIs and metrics, we were able to provide a baseline value for each of the metrics that are in that column on the right. In 2023, we filed a progress report, and that was our opportunity to provide a second value for each of these metrics. So this is where it starts to get a little bit exciting, because we can now start to see the trends with each of these metrics and evaluate how that ties back to our plan. So the rest of these slides are going to walk through these in walk through highlights from our progress report in a little more detail. Next slide. So starting with our CBI of culturally and linguistically responsive outreach, we're measuring a couple of things here. As you can see at the top of the slide, about 30%, 31% of our customers are Spanish-speaking households. And so the focus of our efforts has been to make sure that we're getting more information out to those households in their language so that they can engage and benefit from that. On the left, you can see that chart measuring communication channels. And what this is actually showing are the number of different channels for each of the topics in that far left column that we were able to use to disseminate Spanish language materials. So in 2020, looking at that top row, billing options, customer service, we were able to disseminate Spanish materials through 4 different channels. In 2021, that actually dropped to 1. I'm sorry that this is the top row. That was as a result of COVID. We had some communications from 2020 that we didn't continue. But overall, looking down at the total row, you can see that the number of channels that we're using across all of these topics to disseminate information in Spanish has increased from 17 to 43. So we've really made a concerted effort to get that information out. We also are monitoring how we get feedback in from these groups. So on the right, you can see results from surveys that we've conducted over the past few years. We typically have designed these surveys so that they have a Spanish language version that customers can respond to if that's their preference. And we've been focused on making sure that that is getting out to people and they're able to engage with that. And we've seen the percentage of responses in Spanish to our customer surveys increasing. Next slide. So another of our CBIs is to increase our community-focused efforts and investments. We have a few metrics under this CBI. This is looking at 2 of those. On the left, you see community workshops. These are workshops that we host, often related to our energy efficiency or other programs for vendors, for customers, different audiences that might engage with those programs. In 2020, we had 2. In 2022, you can see that the number increased substantially. A number of these workshops were actually done online, and we were able to observe participants from different areas across our territory joining in on those. So I think I should pause here to mention that we're showing values for HIC and non-HIC. HIC stands for high impact community, and in our CEIP with our CBIs and metrics, we are monitoring impacts across different customer segments. I will talk a little bit more about that, I think, in the next slide, but I just wanted to call out that I am going to explain what that means. So I'll jump to the right. Public EV chargers installed is something that we're monitoring. We did see an increase from October 2021 to May 2023. As with a lot of our metrics, there are a lot of different factors in the market that are coming to bear on the trends that we're monitoring. So it's not, these changes are not necessarily entirely or even at all a result of our activities. And this is one of those cases. So there has been an increase in public EV chargers, but our EV programs were not active at the end of May 2023. And so this increase isn't due to our activities yet. We have been working on a portfolio of EV focused activity and have recently had several of our pilots approved and expect to be getting those up and running quickly. And so we should see that number increasing, hopefully even faster in the future. Next slide. This slide is looking at our results for our CBI of increasing participation and expenditures in our various energy efficiency and energy programs. So we put significant resources into these programs in 2021 and 2022. We increased some incentives, we created new incentives and introduced the new communication that I was mentioning earlier. And we did see a corresponding increase across participation. Some of this is, going from 2020 to 2022. Some of this is due to the easing of the pandemic. But there is also some evidence that our actions had an impact here as well. So many of the changes that we were making really focused on getting more of our incentives and the savings from participating in our programs into the HIC and vulnerable population groups. So these are disadvantaged groups within our customer base. And you can see, for example, in our business programs, looking at the third set of charts down, WattSmart Business, this is our commercial focused energy efficiency program. You can see that tribal participation stayed even from 2020 to 2022. HIC participation increased, and both of those were in contrast to a decrease in participation overall. If you look to the right in the green chart, you can see the results for expenditures. And there you see that in tribal and HIC groups, expenditures increased, and that those increases are really the total of the increase that we saw across all customers. So this tells us that our efforts to direct more of these benefits to those disadvantaged groups was effective. So this is where I will pause and explain a little bit about what some of these terms mean. The HIC and tribal designations are geographic and refer to census tracts. So they're talking about where these customers and projects are located. HIC, which means high impact community, is communities that are designated using a methodology from the Washington Department of Health as high impact due to like an intensity of socioeconomic or demographic risk factors. They look across a wide range of factors. Or they are HIC because the majority of the census tract is on tribal lands, and they may meet both of those criteria to be designated HIC. Tribal is a subset of HIC and is just looking at the census tracts that are majority on tribal lands. And at the moment, that's as close as we can come to observing how tribal members are able to participate in our programs. We also use a vulnerable population designation, which is not geographic based. It doesn't show up in these specific charts, but I will mention it with later measurements. The vulnerable populations are 22 groups that we identified with our advisory group, such as low income or having a primary language other than English, that designates that customer segment as vulnerable. And so we use these two different types of designations, the geographic and the demographic, to give us flexibility to target our programs in different ways. I'll go to the next slide. This CBI, renewable energy resources and emissions, really overlaps with the earlier parts of this presentation. So this is reflecting just the supply side activities that we were talking about earlier. here you see our measurement for 2020 retail sales served by renewable and non-emitting energy resources was 22% and increased to 31%. On the right, you can see the greenhouse gas emissions also changed and look a little bit higher. I will say that both of these at this point in time are largely accounting adjustments. So the retail sales values, that's due to a change in the cost allocation methodology that was effective in 2021 versus now. And on the emissions side, there was a change in how we allocated thermal generation from fossil fuel resources to Washington. So with these two, I would just say that there's a lot that goes into these measurements, and we do have a plan to rapidly decarbonize our power, but it's a longer term effort, and will take a little while to see the effects of that plan show up in these numbers. Next slide.
Yeah, and with that, and with respect to the public process that we really intend this to be, I know we had a lot of information today. But still wanting to be able to provide that public comment opportunity, we might jump to that section just so that we can honor our DSM workshop portion in the starting time for that. All of this information will still be available, and the slides will be shared online. And I do apologize that we just had so much great information to share. So we'll be sure to follow up wherever we can and really get this information disseminated out to everybody who's interested. So thank you so much to all of our presenters in the first half, and apologies again for running on time. But with that, is there anybody interested in providing public comment on any of the information heard today? Again, this is not the last bite at the apple, so to speak. So feel free to drop information into the chat, any questions you have, or follow up directly, and we will be sure to get all of this information out to you and on the website so that it's available for public consumption. Thank you so much, and we have a couple minutes, so and we will be starting the DSM portion of this right at 2 p.m. Thank you.